Now, last time we talked about what Plato's doing generally in this dialogue, and we're going to go back to that foundation as we approach the end. Remember, at the beginning of the dialogue, or near the beginning at least, before we even get into the rational arguments for the immortality of the soul, Socrates is setting up the scenario that we should want, right? That we want reason to lead us here. One of the first things that Socrates says is that we experience pleasure more fully when we're being relieved of some kind of pain. And so sometimes when going through pain can actually lead to a greater degree of pleasure. He talks about the chain on his leg, right? It's restricting, it's burdensome, it hurts, but then he feels that release when it's taken off of him. And so we have hope that maybe a greater good can come through an apparent evil. And so that's the first idea that he's giving us through this drama. Or it's an early idea he's giving us through the drama, maybe not the first. And then from there, he talks about how the philosopher, the true lover of wisdom, is always trying to live as if the body is dead, even when it is alive. Right? Because the body is the root of all the things that we're trying to purge from our souls. That the body, because it has a need for food, that need can easily turn into greed, where now we're over-consuming. We have this desire for things we don't really need because there is a desire that we do have with our bodies, a need that we have with our bodies. And so that leads to greed, it leads to hostility, it leads to hatred. And we could think about the various ways that sexual lust can lead to abuse and disordered passions. And so all evil can be traced for Plato back to the body, the condition of the body. And so if the philosopher, the lover of wisdom, is always trying to live according to these immaterial realities, these non-bodily realities, things like justice, things like loyalty, things like honor, things like beauty, things like the good, well then perhaps the philosopher has reason to hope for death, to desire death, to be rid of this body, that we might live as pure soul, pure spirit, in relation to that which we have always loved. And then from there, we get our arguments for the immortality of the soul. We go from the argument from opposites. I'm not going to rehash all these now. We get the argument from opposites, recollection, affinity to the forms, and now we're going to move into the argument from the form of life. So after the third argument, Socrates' friends, they start kind of whispering to each other, and Socrates says, okay, out with it, what's going on? And they say, okay, we are following with you, but there seems to be a potential problem here. We recognize that the soul precedes life, the bodily life. And so, we followed with you through your arguments so far, but how do you know that eventually the soul won't itself die? Maybe it can go through multiple life cycles, but how do we know that eventually it's not just going to wear out, wither away, and die? And so that's going to lead us up to the fourth argument. And so at this point, Socrates isn't so much arguing that the soul likely survives past death. He's already established that, and his friends have agreed with his conclusions. Now he's simply arguing the particular point that the soul is truly immortal, meaning it will not die, even given enough time. He points out that some things always participate in a particular form. Now, some things can sort of pass in and out of participation, and so, if you have got a cup of coffee, then it can be hot or it can be cold. And so it can undergo that change of temperature, and in so doing, is changing its relationship with the forms. Any number of things can go through any number of changes, right? Where we're trading participation in one form for another. However, there are some things that are always inherently participating in a particular form. For example, fire. Right? Fire always participates in the form of heat. You're never going to find cold fire. Now, some fires might burn hotter than other fires, but all fire participates in the form of heat at all times. So too, ice with cold or water with wetness. There are all kinds of things that have these inherent connections. Well, if the soul is what is our true selves, right? It's the part of us that endures across time. The soul is what animates the body. Then the soul, by definition, participates in the reality, the form of life. And life can never become death, even as two always participates in the form of evenness. And what is even can never actually become odd. And so, because the soul has inherent participation in the form of life, it can never actually die. But that gives us the four arguments for the immortality of the soul. Now, it's worth noting it does not end there. This whole dialogue is going to end much the way that it began, with this idea of desire. And now, I should clarify, when I talk about desire, when I talk about how Plato is fundamentally a philosopher of desire, philosopher of love, I don't mean fundamentally like emotionalism. Obviously, Plato ranks the intellect higher than your emotional center. And so when I talk about desire, I mean that kind of all-encompassing soul desire, as the mind leads the heart, which leads the body to the extent that it can, in the direction of the good that transcends and even overwhelms the capacities of the intellect. And so whatever like the good is, it stands above our ability to reason. Because if we're going to say that reason itself is good, then whatever reason is participates in the good, which means that the good is more fundamental, it's more foundational, it's more transcendent than rationality. Rationality is nested within the good, and what that means is that it can't fully take in what the good is. And so when we are approaching the good, Plato would have us do it with a certain kind of reverence. He is a very religious kind of philosopher, not in the sense of his pagan contemporaries, right, serving the Pantheon Olympus, that he is, I would argue, a more purely religious kind of philosopher, where he wants to approach the good with reverence, with a certain degree of fear and trembling that overwhelms the soul with its beauty. And that is fundamentally what I mean by desire, not just sentimentality, not just emotion, but that all-encompassing soul desire for what is good and what is above what you can possibly comprehend. And that is where we're going to return. So just as we began with desire, now we're going to end with desire as we lead up to this closing myth that Socrates gives us. And I want to talk about this, frame this as the swan song of Socrates. And so before we get to this myth, there's a little bit, there's some talk of swans which were associated with Apollo. And we've already talked about how important Apollo is for Socrates in general, as well as this dialogue in particular. It's cloaked in the shadow of Apollo. And Socrates says, "It is because swans are sacred to Apollo and have a prophetic capacity and foresee the good things that will happen in the house of Hades. That is why they sing and rejoice in that last day of theirs, more than they ever did in the previous time of their life." And that's exactly what Socrates is doing here. He is rejoicing. Socrates is playing the swan here, the swan of Apollo. He has a prophetic understanding of what awaits him in the underworld, in paradise, in the philosopher's paradise. And now he's able to sing that very beautifully. Now, in this myth that follows, Socrates does himself, he calls it a myth or he calls it a tale. He's not providing a dogmatic, revelation-based understanding of exactly what's going to happen when people die. That he has these ideas that he believes he's rationally worked out, and now he's creating a story to frame those ideas. And so you don't interpret this as a dogmatic vision of the afterlife, but interpret it as a story that provides a framework for the things that Socrates believes that he knows and that he believes that he has demonstrated. And I'm not going to go into every detail of this myth that he gives us, but I do want to provide just a broad framework here. And so he says that when people die, they're daemons, not to be confused with demons from Christian theology, but they're daemons, they're guardian spirits, that they lead them in the direction that they are supposed to go based off the way that they live their life. And so some people are going to be swept down into the rivers of the underworld. In fact, most people will end up somewhere in Hades, in the underworld, beneath the earth. And from there, they'll be led in a number of directions. The worst of the worst get cast into Tartarus, potentially forever. This is hell, and for many people, there's no getting out. A number of people will swirl around in purgatory of sorts and then go back into the life cycle. But the best, the true philosophers, not just those who have the job title, right? But the true lovers of wisdom, these are the ones that get to go to Plato's version of paradise. And he says that, imagine that you've lived your entire life in the ocean. Everything's been murky, colors are dull, shapes are not super well defined, everything's sort of wavy, but you don't know that you're dealing with such low resolution because this is the only experience that you've ever had. Now imagine if you're taken up to the surface world, and now you're walking around on dry land. Well, now looking through the clarity of the air, now you're able to see colors more vibrantly. You see shapes better. You can see further, that everything is a higher pitch. Everything is higher resolution. And now you recognize that everything that you once thought that you perceived clearly was but a dim echo, a dim shadow of the reality that you are now experiencing. Well, now imagine you're looking up at the clear blue sky. And what if that is yet another ocean, so to speak? And if you could swim to the top and reach the true surface, where the gods dwell, the ethereum of the heavens, well, what if then you find that all the goods that you once thought you knew, all the beauty you once thought you perceived down on the land below, was but the runoff of this true heavenly reality? And now everything is a higher pitch yet again. Everything is a sharper resolution. And no longer do you deal with the shadows of the gods and their temples, working through oracles and intermediaries, but now you're actually at home with the gods, and you're able to commune with the divine face to face. This is a picture that is very similar to what you get in the Christian understanding of paradise. I mean, not exactly the same, but there's a lot of resonance here. And so this mountaintop experience, right, on the true surface of the earth, at home in the heavens, this is it's what we all desire, right? The reason why the beauty that we experience in this world, at its best, at its most overwhelming, leaves us with a certain kind of homesickness, a certain desire for a home that we've never known in this world and we never could know in this world. And perhaps the reason for that is because we were made for another world. And then after telling this myth, Socrates is finally going to take the hemlock, and with his final words, he's going to ask that the sacrifice be made that would normally be offered when someone recovers from illness, when somebody receives healing. The idea here being that in his death, he is finding the fullness of life. Now, whether you take all of Plato's arguments delivered through Socrates or you don't, I think that if nothing else, Plato gives us some serious things to think about. He's a very existential kind of thinker. I think he touches on certain fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. He touches on our experience as humans, using reason, striving for virtue, and this desire that we all have to participate in the beauty that we perceive when we're looking at the world correctly. That we yearn to not just see beauty, to not just know beauty, but to be related to beauty, to know beauty as it is in itself. And that is what I think is one of the most fundamental contributions of Plato. I think he really gets to these deep desires that we all have if we're honest with ourselves. So I hope that was meaningful to you. I look forward to seeing some of your thoughts on this material. Next week, we will be turning our attention to Plato's student, Aristotle. Until then, Godspeed.